earlier known as E-Explained, our series of online explanatory conversations with domain experts, authorities on specific subjects. I am Monojit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. Explained is rooted in news, but it goes beyond just the news. It is context, it is background, it is connecting the dots, it is explanation. It is what gives you a richer, fuller, more complete understanding of what's going on in the world around us. Today, we are talking about China. China and the new age of global conflict that its inexorable rise has engendered. It's not just India that China is provoking. And it's not just about the kind of military adventurism that the Chinese are pursuing in Ladakh. In capitals around the world, the government in Beijing is seen with concern, suspicion, and fear around us. Its aggressive expansion. Today we are talking about frequent disregard for international law and the new age of global as well as the giant size and power of its economy and technological achievements. It's not just India that China is provoking. Fundamentally, it's not just about the kind of military adventurism. What are the contours of the Chinese military, technological, in capitals around the world? The government in Beijing is seen with concern, global suspicion, and fear. How does India address the challenges? Today we are talking about frequent disregard for international law. To talk about a lot of these issues, we have with us this evening Shyam Saran, one of India's most celebrated diplomats and strategic thinkers. He has been India's Foreign Secretary, the Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, India's Special Envoy for India-US civil nuclear issues, and Special Envoy on climate change. He's also the author of a thoughtful and incisive history of Indian diplomacy, How India Sees the World, Kautilya to the 21st Century. Shyam Saran, welcome to the Indian Express.
Thank you. Thank you.
You have been an expert at this event earlier in 2017, sir. If you remember, we are honored to have you back. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Speaking to Shyam Saran will be my colleague and chief diplomatic correspondent of our paper, Shubhajit Roy. We have a large online audience today, and after about 45 minutes of explanatory conversation, we will open the floor for a limited number of questions from some of you. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome once again. Shubho.
Thank you. Thank you, Monojit. It's indeed a privilege to host Mr. Shyam Saran, who we've all known as the country's top diplomat and a scholar. I've had the privilege of knowing him in the last decade or so, and more closely in the last few years. He has educated us with his writings, talks, and of course, his book. Just to frame the broad contours of the discussion today, as Monojit pointed out, it's been more than 4 months since there has been a border standoff in eastern Ladakh. The Indian and Chinese military are engaged in diplomatic and military negotiations over the last 4 months, but there has been no resolution in sight. China has been on the rise and on the move, and that has created an unprecedented challenge to the world. And it isn't just India in Ladakh that China is provoking. And the nature of the provocation isn't just military. From India's neighborhood to capitals around the world, the aggressive expansionism of Beijing is seen to pose an unprecedented challenge. Now, as in South Asia, India and China are competing like never before, and the fault lines are sharpening in the neighborhood. Now, I can say with a certain degree of confidence that very few people outside the Indian official establishment know the terrain in eastern Ladakh, where the current border standoff is taking place, and understand the diplomatic nuances involved in the negotiations to resolve such a crisis as Mr. Saran. Mr. Saran, who has served in China, Nepal, Myanmar, Indonesia, and has negotiated the Indo-US nuclear deal, knows the nuts and bolts of the China challenge better than most of us. And he has put it very well in his book, How India Sees the World, that was published 3 years ago. And I'll just read out a short paragraph from the introduction of the book. Now, he writes in the introduction that China is and will remain for the foreseeable future the one country that has a direct impact on India as far as international relations go. It is already expanding its economic and military presence in India's subcontinental neighborhood, and not only in Pakistan. Its naval forces now make frequent forays in the Indian Ocean, so far dominated by India. But China, and this is the key part, but China remains poorly understood by India, and this lack of familiarity can be costly when it comes to safeguarding India's interests. Clearly, Mr. Saran, you were being prophetic when you wrote this book in some 3 years ago. And actually, this, in a sense, is the starting point of our discussion today, to understand China's motivations. Mr. Saran, the first question that I would like to ask you is, it's been 4 months since the border standoff began. And if there is one question on every Indian's mind, it is that what does China want? Mr. Saran.
Thank you, Shubhajit, for inviting me to this very prestigious event. And also, we are today dealing with a subject which is uppermost in people's mind. That is how to really deal with the China challenge. And this is not only in terms of what is happening at the India-China border. We hope that it is successfully resolved, but that does not mean the end of the China challenge, because this is part and parcel of the larger point that I tried to make in the book, that for the foreseeable future, if there is one country which has a direct and a very significant impact on India's external interests, its security interests, it is China, and that is not going to change for the foreseeable future. So I think important thing to do is to try and locate what is happening today in a broader context. So let me make 2 or 3 points. One is that we need to recognize that at least since the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008, 2 things happened. One is that the power gap between China and the US, the formidable superpower, both in economic terms as well as in security terms, that gap narrowed substantially. So China recovered faster from the crisis. The United States of America, one would say, and the West in general, one would say, is still trying to deal with the aftermath of that global financial and economic crisis. Secondly, while in the period before the global financial and economic crisis, India was growing at the rate of something like 8 to 9% per annum. China's economy, relatively speaking, was slowing down. So you would recall, particularly during the time that when I was Foreign Secretary, the general international perception was that India is going to be the next China, that India is going to be the next big commercial opportunity. And that opened up a huge diplomatic space for us, within which we were able to successfully negotiate, for example, the India-US nuclear agreement. So the power gap between China and India was large, but it was shrinking. What has happened since 2007-2008? That gap is no longer shrinking, it is actually expanding. So on the one hand, you have the gap with the main rival of China, which is becoming smaller, while on the other hand, the gap between India and China has actually started becoming low. So that is the basic context within which we have to look at what is happening, because what has COVID-19 done? COVID-19 has accentuated, intensified that particular trend. So there is a sense in China today that even though the COVID-19 may have erupted in China, but thanks to the COVID-19 and the very early and very remarkable recovery of the Chinese economy from that pandemic, China, in fact, is very well placed in terms of the future. If we are looking at Where are the prospects of growth going to be? Which country is probably going to be able to give more resources for its security capabilities? It is China. So I think what has happened is that in terms of how China is today looking at the international scenario, the Asian scenario, it sees an opportunity for itself to really emerge as the dominant power in Asia. And since China thinks of power in hierarchical terms, not in multipolar terms, it would like everyone to recognize, to accept that this is an Asian order which is dominated by China, and you need to accept that. So it is not like what Deng Xiaoping told Rajiv Gandhi, in 1988, that, there cannot be an Asian century without the parallel rise of both India and China. Today, I think what Xi Jinping is trying to put across is that the Asian century is a Chinese century. Nobody else has space in that particular space. So this unwillingness to even accommodate India in some way on this border issue, despite there being several, agreements, confidence building measures, whereas earlier they would have tried to sit together and try to resolve issues. Today, they feel, why should we give anything? We are so powerful. The other side has to accept what we are trying to say. So this is why I also feel, just to conclude, that I do not see much prospect of an early resolution of the kind of problem that we are facing at the border.
So very interesting points you made about how the power differential has increased and the gap has increased. And so are you saying that this is how, by coming into Eastern Ladakh, this is one of the ways that China is showing India its place? Do you think that is the correct assumption?
Well, if you look at the Chinese media, what are they saying? They are saying, don't underestimate our ability to teach you another lesson. Right? That, the PLA is so much more powerful than the Indian army is. If you try to, in some way try to confront us, you will end up the loser. So there is no doubt about how China is projecting the current standoff at the border. It is also, in a sense, in the context of the international relationship. What is the message, for example, it may be giving to the United States of America, which is today its main rival, as I said? It has started looking at most issues through the prism of the more confrontational relationship that it has today with the United States. So it is looking at India also in that particular context, through that prism. And it is telling the United States, this is a country which cannot even take care of its borders, and you are thinking of this country as a major component of your, sort of security relationship in this region. It is also, in a sense, sending a message to India that, if there is a confrontation with China, don't think that the United States of America or your other friends can come and support you in any way. And as also there is a message to the smaller countries around in our own neighborhood. That in terms of, which country is the dominant power even in the subcontinent, we are a larger, force to contend with than the Indians are. So there is a multiplicity of messages that are coming through. But the bottom line is, as I said, in my earlier remarks, that there is an Asian order which China believes is being created, and that is being dominated by China. Now, this may be its calculation. Whether this calculation is really correct or misplaced, that is another question. Because one aspect, of course, we must realize is power. You have to have the levers of power to be able to have influence. But power also must combine together with legitimacy. That the international community should see what you are doing with having some legitimacy. That legitimacy, I'm afraid, China still does not have, because you see the huge pushback that is taking place to, all the trends that you mentioned about China, trying to be dominant and very aggressive in various parts of the world. It is not going unchallenged. There is a huge pushback. So has China made a miscalculation? Maybe. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. So how the deputy superpower now wants to become the superpower and is trying to send a message to India as well as countries across the world. Mr. Saran, you first went to a very different China on your first assignment, if I remember correctly, in 1974. And you were there till 1977. This was a period of tremendous turmoil, both in India and in China. In India, we had the emergency from 75 to 77. And while in China, Mao's death in 76 led to a shift in the way they reorganized their leadership. The purge of the Gang of Four is what we know. And in fact, India re-established its ambassador level relationship in 76 while you were there. Now, if you could take us through that time when you were there, what is your abiding memory from those days as in China as a country and a society?
Well, one abiding memory is that despite the fact that China was undergoing, huge turmoil, internal turmoil, ideologically, as you remember, that it was a country which had virtually closed itself off to the rest of the world. But it was also a time when very important, foreign policy changes were taking place, despite all that turbulence inside. Don't forget, one of the most historic things which happened was Nixon's visit to China and the establishment of a virtual alliance between China and the United States, despite the huge ideological divide between the two. Okay. So that was a China which, despite that turbulence, was looking at its interests in a very calculated and cool fashion. With respect to India, this was, when I arrived, this was a time when the first thing that I had to deal with, and I was summoned to the foreign office, Chinese foreign office, that was my first exposure to Chinese officialdom, was to receive a very, very nasty protest about what China said, regional hegemonism that India was trying to swallow the state of Sikkim, and saying that this could not be accepted. The relationship between India and China at that time was quite tense, so it was not one of the best of times to actually, go to serve in China. But as you said, we were still talking to each other about the possibility of restoring ambassadorial level relations. But before we came to that, we had to wait out a very, very difficult period in China's history. I recall that, the first Tiananmen incident, we think about 1989, June 4, 1989, but people forget that the very first, Tiananmen incident and huge demonstrations and use of, violence to remove those demonstrations took place actually in 1976, in April. And, we were very young officers at that time in Beijing, and we mixed around with the crowds looking at what was happening. It was also, in a sense, a very exhilarating period, although a rather risky period. But then, yes, when we re-established ambassadorial level relations, I can also say that since then, since Mr. Narayanan, who was later our president, came as ambassador, the relationship between the two countries began to improve, and it took on a much more positive character. So by the time I left in 1977, China itself was trying to, re-establish some degree of order and stability within the country, but at the same time, it was picking up the pieces in terms of relations with the outside world. And of course, as I said, the relationship with India from that time onwards did start improving quite significantly. That is what I have in my mind. Of course, as I said, it was a very turbulent period. We also went through the major earthquake, the Tangshan earthquake, where nearly 1/3 of Beijing was destroyed. Many of us were, staying in tents outside in the embassy compound. So yes, it was a very difficult and challenging period. But my memories of that is also that it was probably one of the more exciting periods during my diplomatic career.
Yeah, you very rightly put it in context that there was an improvement of relationship towards the end of your term, but right in the middle of your term, in fact, in 1975, when the last gunshots were fired in the India-China border at Tolungla, and we saw the references coming up of that period recently, when again we saw, we heard of the first gunshots being fired in late August and early September in eastern Ladakh, in the south bank of Pangong Tso. Now, do you remember the conversations from those days and in 75 when this incident took place? And are there any similar strands you picked up when you first heard of the current incident this year?
Well, it would be difficult to establish a kind of a parallel because, that period was very different. The situation along the border itself was very different. One could even say that at that time we were perhaps better placed at the border than China was because of the effect of the Cultural Revolution. So it was not, in a sense, a kind of a calculated, planned kind of a move. To me, it seemed. But yes, there was an encounter between Indian patrol and a Chinese patrol. I think 6 Indian soldiers were killed. But while this was received in Beijing, where I was posted, with considerable degree of, alarm in a sense as to why this is taking place. Is it related to also the internal sort of turmoil which is taking place? But we were able to resolve it in a short period of time. And of course, the Chinese returned the bodies of the soldiers to the Indian side. But in typical Chinese fashion, they also asked for a receipt for receiving having received the bodies. That gives you a sense of the mindset with which they have operated. So it was a incident, but if you look back upon it, from 1962 to the present, while there have been incidents, they have not really been very serious incidents. And yes, after 1975, it was certainly, it seemed to be a special effort and conscious effort on the part of both sides not to have this kind of violence at the border. And if you recall, in 1980, we resumed the discussions, bilateral discussions on the border between the two sides. And that is what led eventually to a whole series of confidence building measures, protocols, in order to at least manage the situation on the border, even if we could not resolve it immediately.
Right, right. Since we are on the border issue, and the border infrastructure development has been a major issue, and for India, because there has been rapid development on the other side, on the Chinese side, I would really want to know from you, since you surveyed the border infrastructure thrice, and you've done those surveys for the government of India and have seen the asymmetry between the two sides of the border. If you could share with us some of your assessments and impressions of the infrastructure that you saw and analyzed between the two sides.
So the first border infrastructure survey that I was asked to undertake was in 2004, soon after I became Foreign Secretary. And during that time, I went to several places particularly along our eastern border in Arunachal. And in fact, the Chief Minister Apang was very helpful in taking me to several places along the border. And two things came out of that survey. One was that, as far as the LAC is concerned, Chinese posts had come fairly close to the LAC from their side and were well connected to the rear because, most of Tibet is a flat plateau. So communications to the LAC were much easier from the Chinese side. While on our side, because the terrain is very difficult and you have several ridges to cross before you get to the LAC, our posts were some distance away. Most of the posts were some distance away from the LAC. So the one recommendation was that at least those areas where there seems to be some difference between the two sides as to where the LAC is, we need to have a presence. So something like 7 of those points were identified where we need to have a presence and we need to have good communications to go to them. But when we started looking at that, we also found that most of the communications were on the southern bank of the Brahmaputra River. There was very little communication links available on the northern side of the Brahmaputra. So if you have these north-south links, you need to have at least cross the valleys in Arunachal. You need to have a good communication line. So that was the origin of the Trans-Arunachal Highway on the northern bank of the Brahmaputra, and also some bridges that needed to be constructed between the north bank and the south bank. So improve the supply conditions, because even if you made those mountain roads, if you could not get the supplies, from the base areas, it would be of no use. The good news is that that Trans-Arunachal Highway, as far as I know, has come into existence, and most of those north-south links have also come. But make no mistake, despite the fact that considerable progress has been made in improving infrastructure on the Indian side, and certainly on the eastern sector, the Chinese side still has a major advantage, and it will still take time for us to come to anywhere near what the quality of the Chinese infrastructure is. And then as far as the Eastern Ladakh part is concerned, most of the recommendations come from the 2 visits that I made. One was in 2007 and the other was in 2013 when I was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. And here again, the main recommendations were, one, that along the LAC, all the way from Demchok in the south to Daulat Beg Oldie in the north, we should have a continuous alignment, continuous road, which basically parallel to the LAC. And these should be connected with some loops through the mountains to the bases in the Ladakh Valley. And the second most important recommendation was that many of the advanced landing grounds, which had been created in the 60s, but had for some reason fallen into disuse, they should be revived. So that again, fixed wing aircraft could go to these bases and also improve our supply situation and also the deployment of troops in an emergency. And that is why you remember that a C-17 aircraft landed, in fact, at DBO. This was a very major improvement in our supply situation. So yes, there has been significant improvement in border infrastructure, but there is still some way to go. Secondly, that China has, in fact, in the past, objected to this, improvement of border infrastructure on our side. And we have always pointed out that as far as the asymmetry of infrastructure is concerned, we are still very far behind your side. And we have the improvement in our infrastructure has not, in a sense, interfered with the engagement we have had with the Chinese side on the border issue. I know that some people have been saying that it is the improvement in infrastructure which has triggered, the current series of incidents, but it is not something new that has been happening there. This is an ongoing process. And I do hope that we continue to improve infrastructure on our side, because that is fundamental to our being able to meet the kind of pressures we are facing from the Chinese side.
Right. Yeah, you rightly pointed out that these projects have been ongoing, this development of border infrastructure, but possibly because these are now, going towards fruition, towards completion, possibly that has rankled with the Chinese army, Chinese establishment. Could that be a reason?
Well, as I said, even with all the improvements which have taken place on the Indian side, objectively speaking, there is not much for China to really worry about. So I think we should be fairly clear on this point that certainly as far as the infrastructure on our side is concerned, it has improved our position. Right. But it is not a improvement which matches in any way both the terrain advantage which the Chinese have, and secondly, the enormous amount of resources that they have devoted in order to really build up the infrastructure on their side. So I think I have pointed out before that between 2007 and 2013, the 2 visits that I did, the remarkable change was that many of the hillsides on the Chinese side of the LAC had observation towers, which I had not seen before. Right. There were surveillance cameras, like, for example, on a helicopter ride from Daulat Beg Oldie towards the Karakoram Pass. When you are flying, then you see there are surveillance cameras watching you right across up to the pass. Yeah. So they have invested a huge amount of resources. And that is why when Indian patrols leave their bases in order to go on patrols, the Chinese side immediately know that such a patrol is taking place, which was not always the case before.
So they have eyes on every movement of our troops or of our movement that you witnessed at that point?
Well, I wouldn't say each and every movement, but certainly in some of the key areas, they have a surveillance capability which they did not have before. And therefore, it has certainly improved their ability to track what may be happening on the Indian side.
Does the Indian side have the ability, the reconnaissance surveillance capabilities?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. I mean, and I think they more recently they have been using also drones, etc., to improve our surveillance capability. So it's not that there should not be an impression that we have been sitting still on our side. In fact, considerable amount of improvement has been made on our side and will continue to be made, I'm sure. But we just have to accept the fact that the other side has more resources and has had a certain lead time in improving the infrastructure on its side. And we are still in the process of trying to catch up.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things in the last 4 months, one particular statement or one particular issue that has come up and it has been reiterated is that there are differences in perception on the LSE alignment. Now, you have been very cautious about use of that phrase. Can you explain and elaborate this a bit for our viewers, for the Indian Express readers?
Yeah. So, as far as the line of actual control is concerned, we know exactly where the line of actual control is. They are all described on our army maps with very detailed coordinates. You have the various patrolling points which have been identified by the China Study Group on the LAC or very close to the LAC, up to which our patrols will be going. And these keep getting revised as the infrastructure, gets improved. So it is not that we don't know where the line of actual control is. Mm-hmm. That is, what is the point up to which we have been exercising jurisdiction and our patrols have been going, and we have generally exercised control over those areas. Now, if there is a difference in perception, it is not that we have a difference in perception about where our LAC lies. The difference in perception arises because at various points, the Chinese say we have a different idea of where the LAC lies. So the difference in perception is not because we accept, oh, that there is something vague here or something ambiguous here. There is no ambiguity from our side. That should be very clear to everyone. The ambiguity is brought about only by the Chinese contesting where the LAC lies. And it is for that reason we have the various confidence building measures and also protocols, because if the Chinese patrols are coming into areas which are under our jurisdiction, but because they believe that their line of control is further, towards the west, and our patrols are going to areas which are further east, then there are protocols saying, okay, when these encounters take place, you should not engage in any kind of violence. You should not be carrying arms. You should politely, maybe tell each other that you are transgressing, and you should disengage. Those are the protocols, and those are there precisely because of this the ambiguity created by what the Chinese say is the line of actual control. So I think one should be clear about this. And if you will allow me to make another clarification, okay. You see, there are these points along the line of actual control, as we know our line of control, where there are patrolling points. And these patrolling points are determined by the ability of the ITBP and the armed forces to be able to go regularly to those points. Now, to go to those points, you have to follow a certain route. And that route is determined by the terrain. Sometimes it may be along a ridge line, sometimes it may be along through mountain passes, maybe along river valleys, nalas. Right. So connecting these particular patrolling points, there are patrolling routes. Right. Right. Now, patrolling routes are not the same thing as the line of actual control. Mm-hmm. So there is sometimes a gap between your patrolling line and the LAC. Does not mean that if you are going across from the patrolling line, that this is a transgression from your side. But it is very important that as your infrastructure improves, this particular zone between the patrolling route and the LAC should be covered more and more frequently, because your presence is required in that area, because that is under your jurisdiction.
Yeah. So you rightly pointed out about the, how the patrolling points have been chosen, and there are many more face-offs that happen now because of the increased infrastructure.
Yes.
Earlier in June, in this kind of a border standoff, when the Prime Minister of the country says that neither has anyone intruded into Indian territory, nor has anyone captured any military post, in the middle of India-China border negotiations in a standoff situation, does that weaken India's negotiating position?
Well, I have already said that maybe, that particular statement was open to misinterpretation and was open to be misused by the other side, which lost no time to actually misuse it. To basically say, well, your leader himself is saying that we have not intruded. So I think, that is behind us now. I think it is fairly clear, and the defense minister has also made it fairly clear that we are facing a situation of transgression from the Chinese side. Otherwise, if there are no transgression, then why should there be any kind of encounter between the two sides? So that's not something which we need to reopen that issue. But I think what we have to recognize is that those transgressions which have taken place, we are insisting that we should go back to status quo ante as of April. While the Chinese side appears to be insisting that they will stay where they are areas which they have occupied as a result of the recent transgression. So that's really the challenge. How do we persuade the Chinese side to really go back from the areas which they have occupied now as a result of the... Now, as of now, we do not seem to have reached that point. So we are talking about disengagement, we are talking about de-escalation, but I do not see any signs of there being a willingness on the part of the Chinese side to actually vacate some of the additional areas that they may have become entrenched upon as a result of these moves. So this, I suspect, is going to be a longer haul than usual, and perhaps may extend over the winter months, which would be, of course, a great hardship to our troops, a great hardship to the Chinese troops, and it would be very expensive. It will need a lot of resources at a time when we can ill afford those resources. And don't forget that we have had face-offs in the past, which have actually lasted for a fairly extended period, like the one in Sungdorong-chu in the eastern sector, that was resolved only after about 7 years. I hope that it will not be the case here. But we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared for a long haul.
Yeah, we have to be prepared for the long haul. There is no resolution in sight. The talks have been going on. And one of the ideas on the table has been to forge strong international strategic coalitions to take on China. Now we have seen how the Quad group has been revived, and like the 4 countries, the US, Japan, Australia, have been cooperating on this issue. Now, some point out that India is the only country in the Quad grouping which shares a land border with China. So do you think it's a sort of a risky move, or should India go ahead and be more proactive in its moves when it comes to engaging with the Quad, especially in the defense and security areas?
I think there is a misconception that, having strong relationships with partners who share your security concerns is somehow provocative. Why should it be? A principle in diplomacy is that if you have very few friends and the more isolated you are, your friends will take you for granted and your adversaries will increase pressure on you rather than decrease pressure on you. Okay. So I think we should always keep this principle in mind. My belief is that having stronger security arrangements and relationships with countries who have similar concerns as India about this aggressiveness and assertiveness of China is, in fact, one of the ways in which you can address the China challenge. So I would hope that we do not listen to those voices which say, oh, don't be provoking China by doing this. Also, as I tried to point out in the beginning, don't forget that it is not just the Quad. There is a fairly, almost a global kind of a pushback against this new kind of Chinese assertiveness. So it's not only the Quad which is getting concerned about what China is doing. If you ask the Southeast Asian countries, if you ask even the West European countries, even in Africa, there is quite a strong pushback against China, and one would hope that seeing this pushback, China will, readjust its policies. Even in the Chinese media, there are articles which bemoan the fact that despite the fact that China is so powerful, that China is giving assistance to so many countries, why is it that everybody seems to be against China? There is that sense also that maybe we have overstretched ourselves somewhat. So I think this is certainly a part of the ways in which we can try to bring about a restraint on China. But yes, it is certainly true that if you think that any of the Quad countries will come and fight your battles for you, whether it is against Pakistan or China. I'm afraid that is not the case.
Right.
You will certainly get support, as you are getting from these friendly countries, and that support is very welcome. Any support in the form of military support, or in terms of technology support, all that is very important. But I do not think that we should have the assumption that somehow the Quad is coming to help India deal with China at the India-China border. I don't think that is the case. Secondly, ultimately, what is necessary for India to do is to shrink the power gap between India and China. That is fundamental. That is not, it should not be that it has to happen overnight. But as in 2003, 2004, your trajectory was of a very high growth economy. As I said, 8 to 9% per annum. So even if there was a gap between India and China, you were seen as shrinking that gap. And that dramatically changes international perceptions. That would also change Chinese perceptions. So there is no getting away from the fact that the most fundamental decision which has to be taken by Indian leadership is really to put your head down and to get India back to a high growth trajectory. Whatever reforms are required, whatever difficult decisions have to be taken, they need to be taken now, so that you develop India's capabilities. First, its economic capabilities, because military capabilities can only be based on a strong economic base. So that is really the message, that there is no way that you can expect others to, as I said, fight your battles. Ultimately, it is the strength that you have as a country in terms of its economy, its military capabilities, its technological capabilities, which will determine whether or not you are positioning yourself to really meet the China challenge.
Right. You rightly pointed out that how India has to develop its capabilities first and not rely on others to fight India's battles. But you have engaged with the US for many, many years. You were one of the main negotiators for the nuclear deal. If I would like to ask you about the reliability of the US when it comes to countering China. Now, the Trump administration has been very combative for their own domestic political reasons, also their ideological reasons. And it is facing elections in the next month and a half. Now, given Joe Biden is leading right now, and if the Joe Biden presidency takes charge, do you see that US posture changing or softening over a period of time?
There may be some change of style, perhaps. But, my sense is that the confrontation between China and the US has really taken on a structural character. Because I think there is certainly a very, very strong sense of threat that the US perceives from the emergence of China, and with the, as I said, the narrowing, power gap between the two. So I don't see a early kind of a resolution of this confrontation between the two sides, irrespective of whether it is a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. The manner in which China-US relations are managed, maybe there will be some change, but not in this fundamental contradiction between the two sides, and particularly the sort of decoupling that is taking place, particularly with respect to the high-tech sectors. Because that's really goes to the heart of the economic and commercial interests of the United States and of course of China. So that is not going to change in a hurry. It will not be like the Cold War between US and the then Soviet Union, because China and the United States, even with that decoupling, there are many other areas where they are very strongly integrated together. And you can't unravel that, overnight. So decoupling has its limits. Right. But certainly with respect to the technology side, there is going to be further decoupling between the two sides. So even if there is a change in administration, that sort of fundamental structural kind of a confrontation is unlikely to change. Will you be able to take US as a reliable partner? I don't think there is a question of reliability here. It's a question of what kind of assumptions you are making with respect to the evolution of the international situation over the next, say, 5 years or 10 years. And if I'm looking at that particular period, I see very little change in that trend of greater confrontation between the US and China.
Right. So on that note, I'll move to audience questions. I have to say we have got almost over 250 questions on the chat box. And this, obviously, you've been very engaging in your responses and your thoughts. The first question is from Vice Admiral retired Shekhar Sinha. He wants to ask a question. Sinha, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please, sir.
Thank you very much for getting me invited to this forum. It's always a enrichment or education being audience of Ambassador Shyam Saran. I have been a great follower and a student of his. Sir, I fully agree with you that when you said that whether China has arrived on the world scene or not, that is yet to be seen. And my own sense is that economically, while it might overtake US soon, military technological complex has some distance away, maybe a decade or so. But slowly the gap is reducing. So that's a very good observation you have made, sir. My question is, sir, that should China become militarily offensive in the South China Sea, in your opinion, do you think that the more than one country will have to come together to prevent the unlawful aggressiveness of China or not? And would you believe that there will be more than one country required, or maybe to show that yes, so many countries are opposing the offensive moves of China?
Thank you, Admiral. As you have pointed out, with respect to South China Sea, don't forget the Chinese have already made some very significant gains. They have been able to, for example, occupy some of the offshore islands, and they have, militarized those islands after having promised not to do so. And the improvement of their military capabilities, naval capabilities in the region continue unabated. Now, while that is the case, but if I see the current balance in the South China Sea, if you take the assets which countries like, say, Japan, the United States, Australia, and even to more and more India itself, as well as some of the other ASEAN countries. For example, Singapore has a rather robust, naval force. So if you take into account the balance between what China has and what some of the other major powers have in the region, actually, this area is a very contested space. It's a rather contested and I would say a congested space. So I do not think that China is really in a position to somehow make this into a Chinese lake as it wishes to. It would rather want to do this in an incremental fashion as it has been able to do in the past. Now that is becoming more difficult because now most of the countries in the region are extremely wary of what the Chinese are doing. And this is one area where the military expenditures have been rising at the fastest pace. And the naval component of those expenditures is perhaps the largest. So there is already, not only in terms of the current balance heavily in favor of the other major powers, but also if we are looking ahead, other countries are quickly building up their capabilities. So even though China identifies this area as its very, very sensitive security flank, frankly speaking, even if it has occupied those offshore islands and it has declared that South China Sea is like a Chinese lake, I do not think that in terms of the military situation and the naval situation, I do not think that China is in a very strong position.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. The next question is from Danish ambassador, Freddie Swan. Ambassador, please unmute yourself and ask a question, please.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to listen to Mr. Saran. I have one question about the Quad or the Indo-Pacific. How far can that move, and how far will India be ready to move in that context? Thank you very much.
Oh, one, I think if you look at the last couple of years, what is in fact quite remarkable is how quickly the concept of the Quad has crystallized, and it's also been sort of elevated to a higher political level. It has already met at the foreign ministers level, and I believe that maybe another meeting at the foreign minister level will maybe convened not in the not too distant future. So the Quad has certainly started coming together. The naval exercises have already been taking place among Japan, India, and the US. And it is likely that, in terms of a multinational sort of exercises, maybe Australia may be joining in the next series. So there is no doubt that from India's perspective, this is certainly a very important, grouping, and we certainly look forward to its being further consolidated. I think the question to ask is whether India is looking at this becoming some kind of a multinational military alliance. I don't think that we have come that far. What may happen in the future, I do not know, but certainly I think while India is ready to work more closely together with its partners in the Quad, it is unlikely to go beyond that threshold. It's still very much on the security arrangements are very much on a bilateral level. They have not yet been multilateralized. The other aspect is that India would certainly like there to be a more open, inclusive, transparent kind of a maritime security architecture in the region, if that were possible. It is our belief that, China included, have major interests in the security of sea lanes connecting Indian Ocean and the Pacific, so the so-called Indo-Pacific. All the countries have a major stake in the security of this particular ocean space. So given a choice, I would certainly hope that we are able to get a more multilateral kind of a security architecture, which, as I said, needs to be inclusive, needs to be transparent, needs to have a degree of balance, rather than each country or small clusters of country trying unilaterally to serve their own perceived interests. However, if any country, and particularly in this context, China, believes that its interests are better served by an unilateral assertion of power, and which sometimes seems to be the case, then, of course, don't be surprised if there is a countervailing coalition which tries to come together and try to restrain and restrict China. And I think that is the threshold where we are at this point of time.
Right. That's very interesting point you made. My next Our next question is from Professor S.D. Muni, one of India's known strategic experts. Professor Muni, could you please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Well, thank you very much. A very simple question. What is the domestic political dimensions, both in India and China, of the Ladakh standoff?
Well, as far as India is concerned, whatever changes may have taken place with respect to the status of Jammu and Kashmir, even though the Chinese have referred to this in their media as one of the trigger points of what has been happening in Ladakh. But I'm not so sure about that because, frankly speaking, if this was such a major issue for China, and this happened in August 2019, then one would not have expected Xi Jinping to travel for a very high-profile, summit in Chennai just a few months thereafter. So yes, there were concerns, but I think the foreign minister also assuaged Chinese concerns on that aspect. But so I do not think that played such an important role in terms of triggering the current series of incidents. Now, as far as internal situation in China is concerned, I would only point out that, there is been a sense in China for some time that thanks to the shrinking of the power gap with the United States and the West in general on the one hand, and certainly compared to other countries in the region on the other hand, this is a very propitious moment for China to assert its power. And I think if you look at the Ladakh incidents, they come after the COVID-19 pandemic has erupted. And what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is that even though this, as I said, actually started in China, but it is China which was able to bring it first under control, and economic recovery in China has been the fastest. So China is probably going to be the only major economy which is going to end this year with actually a positive rate of growth. So partly, I think, as far as the internal situation is concerned, those who believe, and that includes the President Xi Jinping, those who believe that there is a certain window of opportunity which has been opened, and some of the areas where China has been not able to really push and assert its interests, this is the time to do that. I mean, you know that even with respect to Taiwan, there are voices saying that this is the time when actually, the reunification of Taiwan should take place. This is the reason why we have seen the kind of changes that have taken place in Hong Kong with the security law, for example. And the explanation from inside China has come is that this is really an opportune moment when others are so preoccupied with the COVID-19 pandemic and their economies are in disarray. China, relatively speaking, is in a very good position, is in a good place, and therefore don't lose this opportunity to really assert and gain whatever you can as far as the external interests are concerned. So that is perhaps in terms of the domestic situation in China. This is perhaps a reflection of that. I would only like to add that while that might be the dominant perception that may be there in China, there is also within China a debate taking place. There are people, even in influential positions, who say that maybe we have gone a bit too far and this was perhaps not the right thing to do.
Right. Since we are in the internal situation in China, you went to China for the second time in your career in '83 and served there during the Deng Xiaoping era from '83 to '86. You were there. I remember you once told me that Deng Xiaoping was an undisputed leader, even while having only a relatively innocuous formal position as president of the Chinese Bridge Players Society. Now, today, Xi Jinping has amassed power unlike any Chinese leader in recent history. He has anointed himself as the head of the party, the government, the military. Now, what does it say about President Xi Jinping? Is he an insecure leader? Is he facing opposition within? What are these signs tell you?
There is no doubt that Xi Jinping has emerged as one of the most powerful leaders China has ever had. Even if you compare to Mao, Mao did not have, in a sense, control over the scale of resources that Xi Jinping has.
Right.
Yeah, Mao may have had very oversized ambitions, but did not have the, wherewithal with respect to that aspiration. But here you have a leader who has, very, very real levers of power in his hands. And I think what really has been the reason why, in a sense, an opportunity has been created for him to emerge as the undisputed leader is also that sense of, the party regime being under some kind of threat. So when he became the leader of the party, there was a sense that the character of China was undergoing a change. There was, of course, the issue of corruption. The party was, in a sense, in retreat from, various sectors of economic life of the country, and even politically, there seemed to be some embrace of, liberal democratic principles. These were seen certainly by some influential sections within the party as threatening the regime itself. That if the regime did not bring about a change, it might find itself under threat. So there is a famous speech by Xi Jinping basically pointing to why in the Soviet Union, the revolution had collapsed. Right. And it was precisely because, the kind of control that the party should have had ideologically, politically, and over the armed forces, that had been allowed to diminish over a period of time, in the name of, say, Petroika or political reform. So he would say that the biggest nightmare that I have is that China may not see another Gorbachev emerging here in our country. That is how, he saw the political, challenge within China. So in that sense, what he has been doing is really responding to that sense of threat to the regime itself. That is the party regime, that is the Leninist party state. So in that sense, how do we explain that he's been able to capture all these levers of power without too much opposition? Partly by using this argument that unless we do this, there is a very real threat that, the party regime, the Communist Party of China, as the leading political, entity in the country, might actually lose its power. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, it should also not come as a surprise. The second part of your question, is there a sense of insecurity? Every, strong leader, every authoritarian leader, the more power he is able to marshal, the greater the sense of insecurity that he has, that this might be lost. So every expression of dissent, every expression of opposition is met with a very, very strong response. You saw the recent case of even a so-called princeling, that is a part of the Communist Party elite, who dared to criticize Xi Jinping as a clown or an emperor without clothes. He has been put in jail for 18 years. So there is certainly there is dissent, no doubt about it. But there is also, I think, a sense of insecurity in the leadership. that, having accumulated so much power, there will be people who will be trying to somehow overturn this. And in that context, the nationalism element also then starts playing a role.
Right. In the early months of the pandemic, I remember reading a lot of columns and especially in the Western analysts likening this pandemic situation to the Chernobyl moment, and maybe this could lead to a sort of a crisis and collapse of the Communist Party regime. You think Xi Jinping anticipated that and has turned that crisis into an opportunity to sort of again regain his control or sort of consolidate his control?
Oh, there is no doubt that there was a certain period immediately after the news of the pandemic broke, that there were very major questions asked about the role of the leadership. There was a lot of popular, discontent that, such a major threat to the health of the people had not been, brought to their notice in a timely fashion. That those who tried to warn the public about this, they were actually treated as being almost traitors to the cause. Now, if you compare that period immediately after this news broke to the manner in which, number one, the pandemic itself was brought under control using very, very strict and ruthless, in a sense, measures. And the fact that since then, as I said, China seems to have not only brought the pandemic under control, but is also seen itself as the only country which is actually doing quite well on the economic side. So the very negative opinion about the leadership, in fact, changed to a somewhat of a positive evaluation of the leadership, particularly in comparison to what was happening in the rest of the world.
Right.
So I think the leadership was able to say, see, while we have been successful because of the nature of the Chinese state, because of the very efficient controls that the Chinese state has, because it has this very centralized leadership, we have been able to do a good job in managing this crisis and emerging from it. But look what is happening to the great superpower, the United States of America, or to Western Europe and other countries. We are actually helping them overcome this crisis. So yes, there has been a turnaround in terms of popular perception about the leadership and its ability to govern China in a more efficient fashion. No doubt about it.
Right. So moving on to the next question is from Govind Srivastav. Mr. Srivastav, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, good evening, Secretary Sir. There is one question from my side. As you said, there is a lot of soft power when a country like China rises. So if we see their manufacturing capabilities and if we see the literature, they have been working on a very coherent plan, including universities. If you see the research output of Chinese universities and the manufacturing complex, this has been a very, very coherent and very strong strategy at work. And if we compare India, there seems to be, at least in manufacturing sector, quite disarray. So what do you, sir, see in this situation? Do we see that there will be an emergence of a structure which will look into this gap that academia and the industry, manufacturing, and our semi-skilled and skilled labor workforce, education system, something of that nature, will it emerge, or how do you see, sir, going forward from here?
I think whatever the differences that we may have with China, I think whatever lessons we can learn from China's very successful experience in terms of developing its economy, in terms of building up its human resources. There are lessons that we should certainly try and learn. May not be that you can wholesale copy the Chinese experience in India, but there are certain elements which we can certainly learn from. Now, as far as the manufacturing sector is concerned, or the development of human resources is concerned, this is not something related to ideology in that sense. No country in history, recent history, has really been able to develop without really having a substantial, manufacturing capability. In India's case, actually, the proportion of manufacturing in the GDP has declined somewhat rather than increased, although we have a target that GDP should have at least 25%. As manufacturing derived from manufacturing, but we are nowhere near that. I think the figure is probably 13 or 14% at this point of time. So developing manufacturing capability is key. Second lesson that we have learned from China and from other developing countries is that export growth is also fundamental. No country has really been able to emerge as a successful economy without having a very dynamic export segment. And even India's own high growth phase, if you look at from say the period when we adopted the economic reforms and liberalization in the early 90s up to say about 2007, 2008, in that period, one of the reasons why India had an accelerated rate of growth was also because of a very, very dynamic export sector. This is something that in China's case, of course, you see very dramatically, because it has now become the largest trading power in the world. Don't forget that its trading volume is larger than India's GDP. That's the kind of scale that we are talking about. So what does it mean in terms of our economic strategy? Now, the economic strategy that I would say it means is that, you have to make certain that you create an environment, whether it is the regulatory environment, whether it is the tax environment, whether it is the sort of bureaucratic sort of environment that you have, should be one that really encourages both domestic as well as foreign investment. We sometimes say we have been very successful in getting foreign investment, but why is it that Indian investors prefer to invest outside rather than in their own country? I think these questions have to be faced honestly, because even foreign investors will see whether or not your own domestic investment is dynamic or not. So you have to make certain that you create that kind of environment in which there is a very vibrant manufacturing sector. And secondly, as I said, with respect to exports. And in today's world, you cannot have a dynamic export sector without also having a more liberal import sector, because most of the exports that you will be making also have fairly strong import content because of there being global supply chains, global value chains. So in that context, if you start moving towards a more protected economy, or if you start going back to a kind of an import substitution strategy, then the kind of opportunities for a dynamic export sector also diminish. So these are very fundamental economic issues that have to be confronted. So my own view has been, for example, that with respect to take, for example, the regional comprehensive economic partnership, we decided to opt out of that RCP. My view is that if India has ambitions to play a larger regional role, a larger global role, you cannot do this from the margins of the regional economy, from the margins of the global economy. And by not being part of these, large regional arrangements, you are actually pushing yourself, to the periphery. And that does not really bring about the kind of, whether it is in terms of, your aspirations as a great power, your aspirations as a major economy in the world, it does not serve those interests. So to cut a long story short, I think in terms of, the kind of reforms that are required, structural reforms that are required, of the Indian economy and governance, not just economic, but even governance reforms which are required. This is something which has to be addressed sooner rather than later. Decisions taken today will determine what India will be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time.
So you rightly pointed out about China's economic muscle, and I was reading Financial Times yesterday, and there's a piece that how China has sort of weaponized its economic muscle through what they called in a column called the punishment diplomacy. Essentially, China is one of the biggest trading partners for about 130 countries around the world. And so it seems today that by taking on India and the border, China does not value the Indian relationship. India has taken some coercive steps in the economic and digital domain, but that has not changed China's behavior at the LSE so far. What is the reason, and what, according to you, can change Beijing's behavior?
No, as far as the weaponizing its economic clout is concerned, it is only following the good example led by United States of America, which has, after all, the whole sanctions regime against various countries is a US tactic. So don't be surprised if the Chinese have the economic clout. I'm not surprised that they use that economic clout. So that is something which I do not see as an unusually or uniquely Chinese, behavior. I would expect that a country which has that kind of economic leverage will, in order to advance its interests or to safeguard its interests as it sees it, will try to use that. Now, as far as the India-China economic relationship is concerned, and some of the actions that we have taken, in terms of the overall economic and trade relationship between the two countries, if you are looking at it from the Chinese perspective, frankly speaking, anything that India does to somehow limit, say, Chinese investment in India, or to limit its imports of Chinese goods into India, from the perspective of a decision maker sitting in Beijing, it may not make too much of an impact. Mm-hmm. Right. Also, I would say that in doing what China has been doing on the Ladakh front, they would have factored in a possible Indian reaction with respect to its trade and economic relations. Obviously, despite having made those calculations, they did not think these were important enough for them to actually be restrained in terms of these operations. So I do not think that we have much leverage vis-a-vis China with regard to trade and investment. Yes, going forward, yes, China may suffer, because certainly for some of its companies, India has been the fastest growing market. Access to the Indian market has been very important to those companies and will be more going forward. Say, for example, for Huawei 5G, obviously, if the Indians decide not to go for Huawei in 5G technology, in terms of what a potential market would have been for Huawei, yes, this is a setback. Yes, for TikTok, which has its largest market in India, yes, it has been a setback. But what I'm saying is that when somebody is weighing in balance the economic interests and security interests, perhaps the security interests may prevail over whatever the perceived economic disadvantage may be. So I would not put too much sort of weight on our ability to influence Chinese behavior by merely focusing on the economic and trade side.
Yeah, you rightly said. I mean, someone said recently that how PLA has single-handedly scuttled the business prospects of Chinese telecom industry. So on that note, moving on to the next question from Priyam Kumar Nath. Priyam, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
So basically, sir, what I want to ask is that considering China and Pakistan's borders issues with India since long back, smaller countries like Nepal, which shares a very good relation with India, historically or culturally, as you see, are also bringing up border issues with India. It's like claiming the Lipu Lake, Limpiadhura, and the Kalapani areas of Uttarakhand. So how India should tackle that?
So let us be very clear in our minds that all our smaller neighbors will certainly look for opportunities of being able to advance their interests vis-a-vis India as they see it. If they see that India's relations with other major powers, and particularly in this case China, have become somewhat more tense, it is seen as quite naturally as a kind of an opportunity to advance their interests. So I have always made the point that as far as our own immediate neighborhood is concerned, if you're going to leave open spaces, somebody is going to walk in. You need to make certain that your own relationship with your neighbors is as strong as possible, and you have various assets in terms of ensuring a strong relationship with your neighbors. Now, as far as Nepal is concerned, I certainly believe that the recent moves that have been made by Nepal to expand the area of difference with respect to the border, particularly around the Lipu Lake area. This is something which is more a reaction to a domestic political situation within the country, where the Prime Minister found himself under tremendous pressure from rivals within his own party. And his political survival was at stake. This came in as a very useful way of fending off that threat. But in the bargain, of course, we are now left with a situation which is going to be very difficult to resolve. I cannot see the Indian side being ready to discuss a expanded claim with respect to the territory around Kalapani, because it has been unilaterally expanded from what was a small area of about 35 square kilometers into an area which is now almost 400 square kilometers. And it has also been put into an official map as a formal part of the territory of Nepal. So the best thing to do with respect to this issue is concerned, that is, we should be ready to engage with Nepal, but should be able to engage with Nepal limited to the original differences between the two countries on the territorial issue. I do not think that we should accept the legitimacy of a demand which is now being made unilaterally. I mean, even Nepali maps never showed this area as part of Nepal. And there are many other areas of engagement between India and Nepal, and we should be ready to continue to expand those areas. What I have pointed out earlier is that with respect to the neighborhood, with respect to the subcontinent, I think what India's effort should be is to try and really emerge as the engine of growth for the entire region. It should be, for example, the transit country of choice for all our neighbors. Connectivity is something that we should improve much more than we have been able to do so far. And not only physical connectivity, we should make certain that whatever regulations that we have with respect to cross-border movement of goods, of peoples, those are as congenial as possible. Because it is only if you create a economically integrated South Asia, where India is seen really as the source of growth and development for the entire region, that many of the political issues that we face in our relations with our neighbors, those can also be then addressed much more effectively. But if we have, again, when we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, I would rather that we talk about Atmanirbhar, South Asia, so that we are also able to take our neighbors along with us. This is something which is fundamental, because unless you get your neighborhood right, it is very difficult to think in terms of a more optimal, regional foreign policy or a global foreign policy, because a disturbed neighborhood is constantly going to pull you down. So you need to make certain that you have a very stable and also a prosperous neighborhood around you, and you are actually very well placed in order to actually emerge, as I said, as the engine of growth for the entire region.
It's interesting you talk about Nepal, and you've mentioned this in your book as well about when you served there from 2002 onwards after the Narayan Hiti Palace massacre. And you talk about in your book that how you maintained a friendly relationship with the Chinese ambassador, sharing with him your assessment about developments in the country. And, one of the lines that I really, it was written in 2017, is very prescient, is that China getting more directly involved in Nepal's domestic politics and significantly increasing its economic profile there. There's a willingness to contest Indian interests in cultivating local interest groups that could advance China's interests vis-a-vis India's. We have not been able to craft an effective counter strategy. Does that hold true even today, and it is apparent with the border crisis?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Because, the period when I was ambassador in Nepal, number one, China's power was not as formidable as it is today. China's main interest in Nepal during those days was really Tibet, its interest in Tibet. It did not want to see Nepal emerge as some kind of a base for, contesting Chinese control over Tibet. This was its main preoccupation. And don't forget that, in the 1950s, Nepal had been like a base for, say, the CIA to assist in the Khampa rebellion. So there is a history. So the Chinese interest was essentially in keeping Tibet safe from any external intervention, and there being any kind of a threat to its control over Tibet. And in that context, if India's influence in Tibet assured China that that kind of intervention by external forces will not take place, it was content to let that situation continue. What has changed is, since then, that China's own power has increased. Its sense of insecurity with respect to Tibet has also increased. Therefore, it sees its interests better served by having direct kind of a political intervention and influence within Nepal than was the case, say, 10 years ago. That is the difference which has. And by the way, it is not only with respect to Nepal. You see that certainly a major expansion of Chinese influence in Pakistan, where China is now also very much involved in the domestic politics in Pakistan. You see that in Sri Lanka. You have seen that earlier in the Maldives. So the earlier refrain that China does not interfere in domestic political affairs of countries, that is not anymore true. By the way, you have seen this also with respect to more developed countries. The influence activities, the United Front work departments, activism. In, say, Australia, the influencing or buying influence through some of the parliamentarians, or what they have been doing using the so-called Confucius institutes in various countries, again, to gain influence and also to obtain information, and even in a sense use some of them as agencies for espionage. This is something which is a new element in China's external engagement, something that we had not seen in the past.
Yeah. You rightly said, India and China are contesting more and more in its neighborhood. Some of India's actions have also created negative sentiment amongst our neighbors.
Yes, sir, true. Yeah.
A case in point is the passage of the CAA and the NRC, which has not gone down well with Bangladesh. Now, in a situation like this, do you think such moves create an opening for Beijing in Bangladesh?
Of course they do. I mean, I think what we have to recognize is that, to the extent possible, we should not mix up domestic political issues with our foreign policy issues. If domestic political compulsions or domestic political needs start influencing the manner in which you deal with the external world, in particular your neighbors, then you are already on a slippery path. So even with respect to, say, our relations with Pakistan, it has become very much now embroiled in our domestic political debates. The whole communalization issue, or the anti-Muslim kind of trends that we see in some sections, that influences the manner in which you deal with Pakistan. So I would say that it does not make sense to have a live border with China and also a live border with Pakistan. So you should try to fashion a foreign policy which is reducing the sort of a band of vulnerability that you face. But if domestic political compulsions come in the way, then it does in fact erode your security interests. And so yes, with respect to Bangladesh, to be able to say, don't pay attention to what is happening here, it has nothing to do with you, I'm afraid that is not realistic. Particularly in today's world, where anything which is happening in one corner immediately gets reflected somewhere everywhere else, it is not possible to make that kind of distinction. So my plea would be that in fashioning our foreign policy, in determining our external relations strategy, we should try and insulate that as much as possible from the domestic politics. It's not always realistic because, especially with neighbors, to make a very, very, clear line between domestic politics and politics with respect to our neighbors is not always possible. But to the extent that you can, you should, because otherwise it makes foreign policy making that much more complex and difficult.
Right, rightly said. It makes making foreign policy much more complex. The last question, we are run out of time. Last question is from Priyanka Bairagi. Priyanka, can you please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much to Indian Express to give me a chance to ask question with Mr. Saran, which is one of the greatest diplomat of India. So my question is, how much diplomacy plays an important role to prevent or save warlike situations, border disputes, and treaties? Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah. So the whole purpose of diplomacy is precisely to prevent war from taking place. That's the rationale of diplomacy. It is when diplomacy fails that wars erupt. So that is that a diplomat's job is, in fact, to prevent situations from going to a level where issues can be settled only through a clash of arms. That means diplomacy has broken down. So diplomacy is very, very important. It's a very significant tool in the hands of states to manage their external engagement. And a corollary to that is that the manner in which you can play this role is only if you do not frame issues in black and white. Because as soon as you start framing issues in black and white, then the possibilities of compromise, the policies of coming to some kind of an understanding become that much more difficult. So this is also very important, that in terms of how we manage our external relations, we should always leave room for some negotiations, some engagement, some conversations, so that you are able to manage even difficult situations. This is something which, if you are a diplomat, you should not be always looking at how what you say or do is going to sound to some domestic political constituency. That is not your job. Your job is to really manage relations with other countries in a manner which ensures that there is a peaceful external environment for your country to follow what is really important for you, pursue what is really important for you, which is really the development of your country and the welfare of the people of India. That is the most important objective for any foreign policy. Now, that objective cannot be served if diplomacy fails in avoiding that kind of a clash of arms. So I would say diplomacy is absolutely critical in terms of managing the external environment.
So at the current juncture, when the non-escalation is the new approach agreed by the two sides after the 6th round of military diplomatic level talks, what's your sense? Will there be a conflict between the two countries? Do you foresee that happening?
Well, I can't predict what will happen, but I can only say that as long as we are able to engage in these conversations, both sides have an interest in continuing these conversations, continuing a dialogue. We should not shy away from that. I think it is to our advantage that we have this engagement, because that enables us to also understand what may be the thinking on the other side. It is only through this engagement that you are able to gauge, okay, what can be the intent on the other side? What are the kind of objectives the other side has? So there is also that element involved. And as long as you are engaged in a conversation, it does act as a element of restraint on both sides in terms of managing the relationship. So I would not sort of support a view that, oh, they are just stringing us along and we should do something on the ground. No, I don't think we should look at it from that point of view. With respect to what the military situation is, that is best assessed by our military forces. What are the ways in which they can prevent any further threats to our territory. Again, they are best placed to do that. And I do believe that whatever there may have been in terms of some encroachments which have been made by the Chinese side, I think the Indian forces are deployed in strength to prevent any further action from the Chinese side. But if you, of course, want to push them out of some of the areas that they may have come into, that, of course, carries the risk of escalation, carries the risk of major military operations, whose denouement we can never predict. So we have to be somewhat prudent in terms of how we handle the situation. But again, to conclude, the continuance of a dialogue, continuance of negotiations and engagement is a good policy to follow on our side.
Right. It's fascinating. We come towards the end of this conversation and we're talking about gauging China's intent. And I want to just go to a paragraph in your book where you talk about the Chinese deception. And you talk about deception as an instrument of statecraft is common to several cultures. In India, it's been used, it's been advocated in Arthashastra and Nitisar. There have been examples of it in Mahabharata, Ramayana. Mughals have used it to subdue their rivals. British have relied on it to extend their empire. But in China, you say that deception is accorded a value more significant than in other cultures. Now, if you were going to give advice to an Indian diplomat who was negotiating with the Chinese interlocutors, would you remind them of this deception, art of deception by the Chinese?
Yes, but the point that I was trying to make was that you have to be very, very careful in reading what China is saying. I have pointed out through some examples in the book and in some other writings also that you may have perhaps understood something in a manner that should not have been understood. I gave the example of the Kashmir issue, where we seem to have come to the assumption that China supports the Indian position with respect to Kashmir. In 1962 itself, when some moves were made by China, some statements were made by China, we complained to China that this seems to go against what you have said before, where our understanding was that you accept the Indian position with respect to Kashmir. So the reply was, did we ever say that Kashmir was a part of India? And if you then went back and you said, no, I mean, it was not that any explicit statement like that was made. So this is where understanding Chinese culture, understanding Chinese strategic idiom in a sense, Chinese history becomes very important. Then you become very careful about making sure that whatever wording you agree upon is as exact and specific as possible. You should not assume that a certain understanding has been reached, even though it is not there in writing or very explicit. Yeah. So this is something that in dealing with any country and dealing with any other rich culture, as rich a culture as China's culture is, there is need for greater study, greater understanding of that country, and not only in terms of its foreign policy. Is not only looking at what its foreign policy has been. I think it is extremely important that you get into the nuts and bolts of Chinese culture, nuts and bolts of Chinese history, because that history very much influences the manner in which China acts today. The template of history is very important. Yeah. And I think that, I would say, Yes, somewhat is missing. In a sense, Indian diplomats are better informed about China because they have to learn the Chinese language, and understanding China is very difficult unless you know the language.
Yeah.
But that understanding cannot be just limited to a few Chinese knowing diplomats. It is something that has to be a much broader kind of an effort. Your universities, your think tanks, there should be and it is a fascinating culture, and it is worth our study. It's very important to what are the roots of Chinese perceptions about India. How do they perceive India? Now, somebody would say it is related to the very rich history of Buddhism, Buddhist contacts between India and China. How India was seen as a parallel center of civilization by China. Buddhism was something that they borrowed from India. So there is a more positive ambience that is created. But there is another aspect which I am now looking at, is the perceptions which developed during the time of the British, colonial and imperial period, where India was being presented by intellectuals as a failed civilization, because it could not prevent itself from becoming a colony of the British. Mm-hmm. So this was not an example for China to follow. Or, that India was the source of the opium which was coming to China. Or there were Indian soldiers and policemen who were in the British concessions in China. And that also colored Chinese perceptions, more recent perceptions of India by China. So you need to understand, all different aspects of that history to determine how China looks at India. So there is a certain history that we need to be aware of.
I have to say, this is indeed a fascinating and insightful conversation. We learned a lot. And I think sessions like these really help our readers and viewers in explaining the challenge in front of us. We really got a sense of the Chinese challenge and the difficult choices that are there in front of us. Thank you so much, Mr. Saran.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
For analyzing the developments with your unparalleled depth and breadth of experience, and explaining the issues to our readers and viewers in an easy to understand manner. Thank you to all the viewers from all over the country. Some have joined from different parts of the world. Thanks to all of you from the Indian Express family for joining in today. Your questions, ideas, thoughts really enrich the conversation. For those who missed the webinar, the video of this interaction will be online shortly. To read, listen, and view more of Indian Express's explanatory journalism, do log on to our website, indianexpress.com. Until the next edition of the Express Explained Live, stay safe and stay tuned. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Subhajit.